Welcome to The Critique. Today we're looking at a submission called Faith, Fertility, and the Future. It's a comparative analysis contrasting global Muslim population growth with the declining fertility rates in the LDS Church in Utah.
Let's jump right in.
Okay, so the first major opportunity for improvement really concerns the core thesis. The manuscript, it does a great job pulling together the data on religious growth, but it separates the theological changes on birth control from the actual statistical decline in fertility.
Right. It treats them like two parallel tracks instead of one causing the other.
Exactly. That's the main structural fracture in the piece right now.
Yeah. The draft lists the 1998 handbook update and then the earlier 1969 statement, but they're just sort of sitting in the history section, almost like an appendix.
It's just context.
It's just context, and it fails to overlay those very specific dates onto the chart showing the TFR drop in Utah. I mean, we're talking about a fall from a TFR of 3.3 in 1980 all the way down to 1.8 in 2023.
That's a huge collapse.
It's a massive demographic collapse, and the piece misses the story of how that, softening of the doctrine actually sped up the shift.
I see what you're getting at. So the suggestion here is to reconstruct the central argument, show how that doctrinal shift from a commandment to more of a personal choice acted as a permission structure?
A permission structure, yes. That's the perfect term for it. It allowed economic realities to just completely override that cultural mandate for big families.
So how do you make that more concrete in the text?
Well, you have to be explicit. You take the actual text from the 1998 Church Handbook, specifically that part that says the decision is extremely personal and private and left between the couple and the Lord.
Okay.
And you physically interweave that quote with the data point showing that Utah's fertility rate started to close the gap with the national average right after 2000. It's not a coincidence.
So the handbook didn't just reflect the culture, it gave the culture permission to change.
It was a release valve. Absolutely. And this makes the contrast with other religious groups in the piece so much more interesting.
Right. You have that Catholic stance mentioned in the sources where contraception is seen as intrinsically wrong. The submission mentions it, but it doesn't really leverage that point.
It doesn't, and that's a mistake. The Catholic prohibition is rigid. The LDS approach, as that geocurrent source describes it, became a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy.
And that distinction is key.
It's crucial. It explains why the LDS population assimilated to national fertility norms so much faster than other high-demand religions. The ambiguity was a feature, not a bug.
It allowed people to have smaller families without feeling like they were, in open rebellion against the church.
And the author has the perfect quote to illustrate this, from the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives source.
3 is the new 6. I love that line. It's so vivid.
It is, but you have to connect the dots. You link that quote directly back to the policy change that's mentioned in the forums, the one that removed the expectation of a bishop consultation for sterilization.
Ah, okay. So a concrete bureaucratic change.
A concrete bureaucratic change that led to a specific cultural outcome. The draft right now treats the culture shift as something that just happened to the church, rather than something the church's own bureaucratic retreat actually helped facilitate.
That's a much stronger, more active argument. Okay, so that's a powerful pivot. Now moving to the second big critique. Let's talk about the drivers of this change.
The economic drivers.
Yes, the analysis of economic factors feels secondary, whereas all the evidence really suggests that economic constraints are probably the primary driver for this recent fertility collapse.
This is the smoking gun the draft is sort of ignoring right now.
How so?
Well, the weakness is that the draft treats things like housing costs and inflation as just background noise. It frames the family proclamation ideals as being eroded by secularism, when really they're being crushed by the market.
So the suggestion is to elevate the economic section, make it the primary counterweight to the theology.
Exactly. The argument needs to be that for millennials and Gen Z, financial survival has simply displaced religious obedience when it comes to family size.
Okay, and I think the housing data is the way to prove that point. You can explicitly link a 94% increase in Salt Lake City median home prices in the last decade?
A 94% increase. You link that directly to the TFR dropping below replacement level at 1.8.
Is that connection fully established in the source material, or is that something that needs to be built up?
Oh, it's there. The New America source is devastatingly clear on this. It brings up the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed by the Trump administration in 2025.
Right, the draft mentions that act, but almost in passing.
And that's a huge missed opportunity. Because, that bill floated things like baby bonuses and a national motherhood medal. But what was the reality?
Modest tax credits?
Modest tax credits, yeah, combined with cuts to Medicaid and food assistance. The piece needs to use this to show the massive disconnect between rhetoric and reality.
Be more blunt about it.
You have to be blunt. You can't pay a mortgage with a medal. That friction point between the political talk in 2025 and the economic reality for a young couple in Utah, that's where fertility is dying.
And this also opens up a geographic comparison that the author kind of hints at but doesn't fully develop.
You mean with states like South Dakota and Nebraska?
Exactly. The sources note that housing there is still relatively affordable. And what do you know? Their fertility rates are still higher than the national average.
That's the control group for the whole experiment.
Right.
It proves that Utah's decline is a housing and cost of living issue, not just a secularization issue. If it were purely about religion losing its grip, you wouldn't see that clean correlation with housing prices across different red states.
That comparison needs to be front and center to validate the economic argument. Okay, let's move on. The third major structural issue.
The global comparison.
The comparison between global Muslim growth and LDS growth. It lacks a standardized scale, and it ends up creating a false equivalency.
This is where the draft gets a little bit dazzled by the big numbers. It juxtaposes the 2.8 billion projected Muslim population in 2050 against the 31.3 million for the LDS Church.
And on a chart, that looks incredibly dramatic.
It does, but it misses the why. It completely overlooks the nuance of a youth bulge versus an aging population dynamic. One is growing by birth rate, the other is slowing.
So the suggestion is to refocus the comparison on the actual mechanisms of growth?
Right. You have to distinguish between migration and youth, which is the engine for Islam's growth, especially in Europe, versus missionary work and retention, which is the LDS model.
Comparing a religion of billions growing through birth rate to a denomination of millions trying to grow by knocking on doors.
It's like comparing the tide to a garden hose. And the Pew data is right there in the notes. The median age of Muslims in Europe is 30.4.
Which is 13 years younger than other Europeans.
13 years younger. That's inherent demographic momentum. It's biological, not just theological. And you have to contrast that biological engine with the aging LDS leadership and membership.
You just can't replicate that with converts alone.
Especially not when you look at the retention numbers.
Let's talk about that retention section because the data is stark. The BYU Scholars Archive source is pretty blunt. It says 50 to 75% of converts worldwide fail to attend church altogether after 1 year.
And the manuscript has that in a footnote. A footnote! That statistic needs to be brought front and center.
It changes the entire projection model.
Completely. Which brings up the missionary program itself. The draft mentions the 2012 age change, 18 for men, 19 for women, as a growth tactic. And applications spiked, right? From 700 to 4,000 a week.
A huge spike.
But did it lead to long-term sustained growth, or was it a one-time sugar rush? The 2014 to 2050 projections seem to hint at a plateau.
So the question is, was that a growth engine, or did they just accelerate a one-time bump by pulling from the future talent pool?
The author needs to be more skeptical of the institution's growth narrative and look at the actual longitudinal outcome.
Right. Sustainable growth versus a temporary spike. Okay, this leads perfectly into the final major issue.
Active versus paper membership.
Yes. The section on the future of the family relies way too heavily on these ideal projected numbers and just ignores the messy reality.
It's a classic trap. And accepting that 15 or 16 million membership number at face value is a big problem. The source material is clear that activity rates, sacrament meeting attendance, are way lower.
How low are we talking?
Something like 25% in South America and Asia, and maybe 40–50% in North America.
So the suggestion is to differentiate between bureaucratic growth, the numbers on the books, and actual societal influence, the people in the pews.
Yes, and the critique needs to challenge the reader to calculate the effective fertility rate, but for active members only.
Not the total membership.
Definitely not. Because if you do that, you're essentially calculating the fertility rate of a ghost population in many parts of the world.
And that ties into the secularization thesis from the religious educator source, right?
It does. That source suggests growth mostly happens in areas that are under stress or modernizing, while stable regions stagnate. If the church is only growing on paper in stable places, well, the whole calculation changes.
And you have the religious switching data. For Islam, the sources say it's basically a revolving door, equal numbers in and out. The room stays full.
But for the Christian and LDS dynamic, it's a leaky bucket. The unaffiliated demographic gained 7.5 million people. That's a massive outflow.
There's one more piece here, though. The data says 90% of returned missionaries pay tithing, but only 87% attend church.
It's a small gap, but it's a very telling one.
What does it tell you?
It hints at the survival of cultural Mormonism, even as fertility Mormonism is declining. People are still financially tied to the identity, but not physically present.
So the identity might be surviving even if the Orthodox practice isn't.
Exactly. And the question the author should ask is, can the culture survive without the large families that sustained it for a century? If the orthodoxy goes, the commandment to multiply and replenish the earth usually goes right along with it.
That's a crucial distinction, the difference between identity and practice. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Let's wrap this up and recap the action items.
Let's do it.
First, integrate that 1998 handbook change directly with the fertility drop timeline. Don't just leave it in the history section. Show cause and effect.
Second, prioritize the housing market data. That 94% price increase in Salt Lake is the story. The economy is the actor here. The theology is the backdrop.
Third, distinguish between bureaucratic and active membership. You have to compare apples to apples when you're looking at global Islam, or at least acknowledge you're comparing an apple to a global orchard.
And finally, realistically assess the impact of those 2025 economic policies. Don't just list the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Analyze its failure to support the very family size the culture says it values.
We invite you to revise the data visualization and the narrative arc based on these points and resubmit the work. There's a really compelling story here. It just needs to follow the data, even when it leads away from the theological ideal. Thanks for listening to this critique.